All right, I think we'll get started. Thank you so much to all of our attendees for joining, as well as our panelists. My name is Rosemary McDonnell, and I'm going to moderate this panel on the future generation of resiliency and climate change. We're really excited about this topic. I think we're all experiencing the effects of climate change in one way or another, wherever we're located in the world. So it's definitely a pressing topic that is at everyone's top of mind. And I just wanted to thank Idaho State University for allowing us this forum to host this Leadership Insight webinar in their series. So on behalf of ISU and our panelists, thank you for joining us. Idaho State University's Institute of Emergency Management is proud to host one of the series of webinars in what I mentioned as the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Leadership Insight series. This series brings leaders and influencers in emergency management and Homeland Security to really share their knowledge and perspectives with the ISU community and beyond. So I see we have a couple of students in attendance, as well as some practitioners in the field. Before we get started, I wanted to highlight a few administrative items with today's program. I had posted in the chat that all participant audio is muted and all questions will be held until after our speakers' initial comments. So throughout the webinar today, we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll try to take as many audience questions as we can during today's conversation. We also have a couple of questions that were submitted on the registration form, so we will try to get to those as well. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our distinguished panel for today. First, before we do that, I'll introduce myself. As I mentioned, my name is Rosemary McDonnell, and I'm an adjunct faculty at Idaho State University's HSEM program. I also work at the District of Columbia Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. I am the senior program manager for the Disability Access and Functional Needs program. If some of you were in attendance to a webinar that we did earlier in this year in the winter on accessibility and inclusivity in disaster, I talked a little bit about my role with that distinguished set of panel members about how emergency management and planning in emergency management really needs to incorporate people with disabilities and other access and functional needs. And I think this webinar today is going to touch a little bit on that because you see a lot of those issues in equity, diversity, and inclusion when it comes to the effects of climate change and resiliency planning. So I won't spoil too much, and we'll get to introducing our panel before we get into the questions. As I mentioned, we're really glad that you're with us today. We're honored to have with us 3 esteemed panelists and experts in this topic of resilience and climate change. Our first panelist is Melissa Deas, who recently joined CADMIS as a technical director to provide leadership on climate and infrastructure resilience projects with federal, state, and local government clients. She has a really extensive experience supporting equitable and innovative solutions for complex challenges, including preparing for climate change, hardening aging infrastructure, and supporting recovery from disasters. So Melissa, can you please describe your experience in resilience and climate change planning?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rosemary. So I've been working in the climate and adaptation space for now over a decade. And during that time, I've really seen the climate adaptation, preparedness, resilience, whatever you choose to call it. I'm pretty agnostic as to what term you use. Change. I think at the beginning of my career, the field was really just trying to figure out what it even was, and to defend that we needed to be thinking about long-term risk reduction from climate risks and not just mitigation. While mitigation is very important, we are going to see the impacts of climate change. And then I think today for a while, we were doing a lot of planning and not a lot of doing. Now I see that we're at a really exciting place where we're starting to be doing a lot of the doing. And so I'm excited to talk to you all tonight about some of that work.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And I was lucky enough to work with Melissa. My position resides in the Resilience Bureau in DC HSEMA. So again, just reiterating how important it is and critical it is to include our most vulnerable populations in this resiliency and climate change planning. So our next panelist is Katelin Wright. She is a Center for Homeland Defense and Security alumni and former Climate and Security Advisory Group Climate and Security Fellow. Katelin uses her professional experience in academic inquiry on climate change to teach and write about climate security. So this is really a passion project for her. And one of those passion projects for her was in the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, writing her thesis in their master's program, and she had received their outstanding thesis award for her research on climate change induced migration. So Katelin, can you please describe your experience in resilience and climate change planning?
Yes, thanks, Rosemary. I really appreciate the invite and being here today. So as Rosemary mentioned, climate change and resiliency is truly a passion project for me. My day-to-day job is training refugee officers. So just last month, I was in Tanzania. And so when I'm not traveling the world and adding stamps to my passport book, this is something that truly gives me a lot of joy. And it really all started with the Center for Homeland Defense and Security and really looking at the intersection of climate change and migration. And since that time, I've gone on and really just expanded on that work that I started at CHDS, and then have gotten to work with Homeland Security professionals. In fact, Rosemary herself, through the CHDS Emergence Program. And so the idea is really working with Homeland Security professionals to look at climate change not only as a threat, but potential opportunity. And that opportunity really lies in climate resiliency. So the way I've looked at climate change and the way I try to approach it in a lot of manners is not just what the inherent threats are, but where we can leverage future trends that could make it possible for there to be potential silver linings. And I really think resiliency is at the heart of that, and really making sure we understand our communities and those most vulnerable within them.
Thank you, Katelin. Very well said. And I'll just do a little plug here for the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. I see a couple other alumni in attendance today. But for any students who aren't familiar, it is a great resource. You can sign up for a student profile, and there are a ton of courses on there. I think some of them focused on climate resiliency, as well as a Homeland Security digital library, which has a lot of research. I'm sure some of Katelin's research and her thesis on there. So highly encourage you to sign up for that. Thank you, Katelin. And Erin Garnaas-Holmes is our other panelist. Erin is the lead climate adaptation planner with the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment's Urban Sustainability Administration. He coordinates implementation of Climate Ready DC, and this is the district's climate adaptation plan, and Keep Cool DC, which is the district's extreme heat adaptation strategy. Erin, could you please describe your experience in resilience and climate change planning?
Sure, happy to, and thanks for having me. My background is actually in landscape architecture and urban planning. So I came into the Homeland Security, emergency management, resilience space kind of sideways. But I was early in my career working as a consultant with a lot of towns around the US that were trying to re-embrace their urban rivers that used to be industrial waterfronts, and now they're becoming redeveloped to be more of amenities. But they had to grapple with water in a way that they weren't used to, or having flooding from rivers. If they were going to live closer to the river, they'd start thinking about that. And I started to become kind of an expert in water-based land resilience and design. And then, long story short, I moved closer and closer into this sort of climate and resilience universe as it related to the built environment, and ended up here at the Department of Energy and Environment, doing this work now, where I'm really serving a role more of a planner. We have these climate adaptation plans and trying to work with other agencies to get them implemented. But I still see it, for me, as a kind of urban design and planning challenge, where we've built our cities a certain way that makes us kind of vulnerable to things like flooding and increased precipitation and urban heat island effect. But I think the transformation of cities to places that are more prepared for those impacts, kind of like Katelin was saying, is going to have all sorts of ancillary benefits of spurring economic development and improving public health by making cities a healthier place to live. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity as we face this big challenge to sort of reshape a little bit what our cities look like.
Thanks, Erin. And I, for one, can say I'm glad that you made it here. I've witnessed firsthand your work in the district and you putting your past experiences lens on the current problems that the district is facing and trying to address those has been really a privilege to watch. So I'm excited for you to be able to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the questions. So thank you again to our panelists. And with that, we'll get right into the questions. As I mentioned when the webinar first started, for anyone who just joined, we collected some questions in advance from attendees, and we also had other questions that we pre-formed, and we'll also be taking questions from our audience today. So while the chat is disabled, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A on Zoom. I'll be checking in a few times to make sure that we take the opportunity to pass on some of our audience questions to the panel, and panelists are more than welcome to type in answers as we go as well if we're running a little bit short on time. But one of the first questions that I really wanted to ask, and I think as I mentioned before, this topic is top of mind because a lot of the areas of our nation are going through either like extreme heat events or other effects of climate change right here and now. So typically we think about what is happening to us currently as our biggest threat, but from the practitioners that we have on our panel today, I'm sure that you've seen threats in all shapes and forms throughout your career so far. So my question is, what is the biggest threat, in your opinion, to our nation's resiliency in the future as a result of climate change? And as a kind of second part to this, do you think that that threat differs from big cities to smaller rural areas? So I will start with Melissa.
Sure. So I think this is maybe not exactly the way you intended, but the threat that I think climate change really brings is that intergenerational knowledge and history becomes less important. And I think we'll find new ways, but basically, I think what climate change means is that we can no longer use the historical record to understand the future risks. And I think that is particularly challenging in tribal nations where a lot of the connections has been to the land and through that intergenerational passage of knowledge about how you react and are engaging with that land. But I think we're going to see it not just in those tribal nations that I think have done a really good job of articulating that particular fear, but in all of the cities, in big cities like the district where Erin and I have worked, it's that we have a historical record of how much rain we've had and which intersections tend to flood and where we have extreme heat problems. But that might not be the same record that we're going to see in the years ahead. And just because we haven't had a hurricane in the district in recent memory doesn't mean that we're not going to have a major hurricane. And so it just makes it a little bit harder to figure out how to prepare. And it also means that you can't just rely on the little events to prepare for the big events, because some of the big events are going to become a lot harder to predict.
Great point, especially as you look at extreme rainfall events. I know I don't think anywhere in the country is immune to extreme rainfall events that we've been seeing in recent times. And I think a big part of it too is, looking towards past generations and how they've experienced heat and comparing it to now. There is a difference, I think. It is getting hotter. And I think that's important to pass on to future generations, that knowledge. Katelin, if you'd like to answer next.
Yes, Melissa, I couldn't agree more. And I think the way I like to coin what Melissa is talking about is climatic uncertainty. We are entering this new era of complete uncertainty when it comes to the climate. So what we could rely on in the past now is no longer relevant. What was 100-year flooding happening yearly, we can say, like in California with these atmospheric rivers. But I think another way I look at this question is not focusing on one specific threat, but really climate change is a threat multiplier. And this is a term that was coined by Sherry Goodman. Big fan of Sherry Goodman. Look her up if you're interested. But the idea here is that climate change doesn't just affect the environment, it also affects human society by amplifying and exacerbating pre-existing economic, social, and political instabilities. And so, kind of what Rosemary was talking about right at the beginning of this is understanding what vulnerabilities lie in our communities, understanding equity and inclusion. And so, I would say that if we try to group it and say there's just one big threat, we're really negating the fact that all of these communities are unique and different. So, New Tech, Alaska, their needs are not going to be the same as Los Angeles, California. And just as an example for those who might be interested, let's look at Salt Lake City, Utah, as an example. In 5 years, the lake may run dry based on current estimates. And that's because of overconsumption of water. But economically, it's a huge boom for Salt Lake City. And then there's this really interesting factor about Salt Lake City that not everybody knows is if it runs dry, it could put a bunch of toxic dust into the air, high in arsenic, lead, and selenium from the lake bed. So here we have exactly what I mean when I say climate change is a threat multiplier. These are pre-existing social, economic, environmental vulnerabilities, instabilities, and climate change is making it worse. Climate change isn't the sole factor, but that's why we have to know our communities and we have to actually look at them, I think, from a very specific approach and not rely on the past. Like Melissa talked about is we need to start thinking about what does it look like in the future and what are things that we're not contemplating now.
Great point, Katelin, on this idea of future planning. And that's something that I think a lot of emergency operations centers are beginning to integrate into their operations is thinking about what's the worst that could happen from the emergency that's currently being experienced. Erin?
Yeah, I was going to answer it much more straightforward fashion and just talk about one of the hazards. I think that heat is everyone feels it. We all talk about it. The news talks about how it's worse than it was last year, but we're all really underestimating how intense things are going to get. I think we're at the very beginning of that hockey stick curve. And heat is one of those things that it can last all summer long or come up in times that aren't the summer. And it's something that affects every human body that is outdoors. So I think that when I stare at the, we just recently updated our climate projections for the District of Columbia, downscaled, but it matches the same charts for everywhere, looking at the number of nights that are going to be over 80 degrees, which is the really dangerous time when the human body can't cool down again. If I had a kid this year, by the time, they're a professional in their sort of same space as me, there are going to be so many days per summer that are going to be like that, which translates directly in my mind currently to so many people dying from extreme heat. And it does have all those sort of intersectionalities that Melissa and Katelin were talking about. Like it's connected to our economy. We'd already know there are studies about how the GDP goes down when there's extreme heat for a long time. And it affects our infrastructure and it affects the natural environment. But it also with like the threat multiplier way, I feel like there are also these kind of game-changing, totally day after tomorrow film from 2012 scenarios that could result from extreme heat. Like, the worst doomsday for me is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation in the ocean. If the ocean circulation stopped because it gets too warm, I think that the entire world is unprepared for the outfall of some kind of event like that. But even on that's like hopefully never happens. And if it did, it's later in the century. But even today and tomorrow, it's already having huge impacts in our cities that we need to be working on. So you don't have to future cast to work on heat.
Yeah, it's happening in the here and now, especially what you were saying about hotter nights. So even if maybe some folks remember it being this hot at some point in the summer, folks aren't getting relief at night like they once were. Thank you so much to our panelists for answering the first question. As a follow-up, in your opinion and experience, what can the individual influence when it comes to mitigating climate change? And I'll start off with Katelin on this one.
So the first thing I would promote is climate literacy, is inform yourself, understand the effects of climate change, and then start changing your consumption habits. I think it's kind of amazing what we're seeing in terms of how corporations and even government is adapting to the bottom line, which is our dollars. So if we are saying, I'm not going to buy this product because you are hurting, because it's palm oil and it's hurting the orangutans in Malaysia, that's going to have an effect. We can even look at it on social media influencers. I know these things sound kind of silly in a way, but understanding what climate change is doing, we do have a voice, and especially when we make it a collective voice. And that can really be through even how we spend our money. Second is more like a hands-on practical level. What we can do is they're simple, small things, but I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I could put in a huge green lawn, but the fact is that we don't have the water for that. And instead, I could make a pollinator friendly garden and make it easier for all of the species here that are native or use native plants to really make my home not just a habitat for myself, but also for all of these species living in New Mexico. You can even make small changes. I know some people hate this when they're like, oh, don't tell me to not eat a burger, Katelin. I'm not telling you not to eat a burger, but what I am proposing is try a flexitarian diet. Add one meal a week, one meal a day that's plant-based. Those sort of small micro changes are nudges to much higher up to say, hey, this is influencing how I'm going to buy things at the grocery store. And I do think collectively they can make a difference. But it's hard to not feel that sense of how do I do something as one single person? And so I think when you can take agency and you can inform yourself, those are the first two steps, and then finding ways to get involved in your own community.
So I'm getting a little bit of a flashback from COVID. I used to work in healthcare emergency management, and these small mitigation actions that a lot of people rejected because it impedes on their freedom. And I think it has a little bit of political connotation when you talk about climate change. That's just what's going through my head now. I'm looking forward to seeing what the other panelists maybe have to work in when it comes to influencing the public to care about mitigating the effects of climate change. So Erin, if you wouldn't mind going next.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree with Katelin. I think that sometimes it's easy to imagine that the little choices that I'm making aren't actually adding up that much. But then I like to flip it around and think about how the marketing and advertising world has figured us all out and put us all in these boxes with millions of other people. So I'm like a white male born in the mid 80s who has a professional job and wears glasses. There are these subtle moves that they can make to make me buy a new pair of glasses from Warby Parker, or to go to a big chain for my coffee in the morning and become loyal to these places. And if I decide one morning that if I'm like, I know I shouldn't, maybe I'll bring a reusable cup to the concert or whatever. I like to imagine that there are millions of other people just like me in my same age and income, demographic, making the exact same choice. And then it feels like I'm not just saving one paper plastic cup. There are 45 million of me or whatever doing the same thing. So we're legion, we're not individuals. And when you do it and tell someone else, you've also, expanded out. But I also think about this from the American dream is to own a little slice of land. And I think as small slice of land owners, if we ever end up, many people rent, but if you do end up owning land, you also have a huge responsibility and opportunity there to do something about climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. Planting a single tree has the same cooling effects as 10 to 12 air conditioners outdoors. It helps absorb stormwater that might otherwise flood the street. And the materials that we choose, have a huge impact on the urban heat island and things like that. So even though it's just maybe your own little parcel you're working with, or maybe you convince your landlord to do something, those also add up and make a huge difference, because I think our built environment has an astounding impact on the climate.
See, I learned something new about my actions every time I talk to you, and I'm wondering, how can we get this message to the public in a way that they want to absorb and that is comprehensible to them, that really influences folks? I think that's really the code we're trying to crack with this whole climate change, individual actions. Melissa?
Yeah, so I will second and third everything that Katelin and Erin shared. On top of that, I'm a big believer that one should try and, as much as possible, live close to where you work, so that you can either bike or take transit, since that's the #1 trip that we make every day. But I'll also answer it just from a much more public safety perspective, which I think the #1 thing you can do is be a good neighbor, to know the signs of heat stress and heat stroke. And if you see somebody in trouble, to check on them, give them a glass of water, to be able to recognize it in yourself if you're at risk, to understand what the major threats and hazards are in your own community, and have a plan to deal with them. If you live in a flood zone, think about where your property might be at risk. Is it something that could be easily fixed by regrading your property, installing a flood vent, getting flood insurance? What is it? Do you have an emergency kit? Do you have a plan, a get home plan from work with your family? All of the basics, I think, are things that we can do. And then if you can not just do it for yourself, but also do it for your neighbors and do it for the people who are around you, I think that is the #1 way that we can keep each other safe, because ultimately, during some big event, we're all the first responders.
I love how you brought up education. I think all of the panelists here and myself are all big supporters of education and educating the public. And I hope that we can find a way to really, as I mentioned, create a message that folks can understand and really want to take in. I think the best example I can think of is a watch versus a warning for a hurricane or a tornado or a storm. That always gets the public kind of messed up because they sound so similar. But if we just keep reiterating what the difference is and what is important for them to really remember from our public messaging, hopefully we can make some progress. So I want to stay on this topic of improvements and looking forward and solving the problem. And with the next question, I want to ask, what innovations in resiliency planning have been developed that benefit the most vulnerable members of our community or the community as a whole? And I think we'll start with Erin.
Yeah, I think we've been really focusing on this in our work at Department of Energy and Environment and our work with the Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency, where you are, Rosemary. One of the, I think the inspiration behind a lot of our work lately has been recognizing that there's a huge impact of in like responsiveness to emergencies or disasters, or in general preparedness, by just building better communities. Like after the Chicago fire in '95, they did these studies, and the communities sort of controlled for income. The communities that responded better were just the ones where they all knew each other. And so you could be in a wealthy community and have like a nice sort of hardened home where you're living, but it could still be devoured by the fire and you might not get out if your neighbors aren't checking on you. But in communities that might have been lower income, everyone knew each other, or not in all of them, but in the ones that did, where they knew each other, they all checked on each other, they helped get out of the building. So we've been trying to do, how do you take FEMA dollars and invest in like getting to know your neighbor? We've been sort of exploring that realm. And one of the tools we're using is resilience hubs, which is the idea of having a community facility that's like a known, trusted place that people turn, maybe a community center, or we're working out right now with an organization that's kind of based out of an apartment building and sort of serves the tenants there and the broader community with things like dance classes and after school programming. Somewhere where neighbors would turn when something went south, and where government can then work with that partner to help in like deployment of resources when something actually goes wrong. But also during most of the time when things aren't going wrong, we can be there building relationships and spending some of our sort of hazard mitigation dollars helping people to get to know each other and build those relationships ahead of time for when something goes wrong. And I think that's an easier way for us to be working with vulnerable residents, like lower income folks that might be harder for us to meet without having a known and trusted community facility where they're already turning, has so far been promising.
Yeah, I think you make a good point with these, especially within resiliency and mitigation, but in disaster planning, a lot of the times it's longstanding issues within the community that are then just exacerbated by the disaster. And by trying to solve those issues, you get better bang for your buck. You get the immediate benefits of enhancing the community, but then in a disaster, you get the benefits of that community really sticking together and helping each other so that they don't overwhelm the government's resources during a response. All right, Melissa.
Yeah, so the first thing that came to mind is something that I think the field is still really in the stages of developing, but I'm very optimistic about where we're going, which is just to actually have the data to show whether solutions are working or not, and whether they're reaching the intended audience, and also to justify to get the grant dollars. So the harsh reality of doing climate adaptation and climate preparedness planning is that you need to figure out a way to get often federal grant dollars to do implementation of your project. And for all of those, in general, you need to submit a benefit cost analysis that shows that whatever you're implementing is going to provide more benefit than the cost of that project. And often, depending on which source of funding, the way that benefits are measured are quite narrow. And so even though we all know that this intersection floods and that Mr. Jones's house is getting just pummeled by it, if we don't have the data that shows that, and we don't have the data to know the value of that house, and we don't have the data to show that if we do this little improvement, then we're not going to get the grant. And so I've seen over the years that we're really doing a lot better of collecting data about where our socially vulnerable communities live, and starting to better be able to tell the story through data about why innovative solutions like a blue-green stormwater park that's going to not just deal with flooding, but also provide a community a place to have a garden, and a community a place to have a farmer's market and to meet one another, to Erin's point. That we are starting to be able to tell that story in a little bit more of a compelling way that I think is starting to also lead to more funding for these kinds of projects.
So from both of your answers, I'm a little surprised because all I'm really hearing is community and the human aspect, and I was kind of expecting this new fancy technology that is being put in place. But I think it really does show that what's important is the people that this is affecting. So Katelin, if you wouldn't mind going next.
Yeah, I'm gonna really have to chime in and say the same. When I was thinking about these questions, to me is the best innovations that I've seen when I've been looking into this always are at the community and grassroots level. It's not at the upper echelons of government, because there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape. Let's be honest. I work in that. I work in the upper echelons of the federal government. I know the red tape. But what I do see and where I have seen success is when the community figures out what they need for their people, for those that are most vulnerable, and then do use the grants to their advantage, like BRIC or some of the different ones that are being offered by EPA, FEMA, etc. But I'm going to use an anecdote here because this is one where I think this is like a great example, and it happened to me. Is I live in Albuquerque. I live in Bernalillo County, and my county started this program for those of us that are on a well system and use septic. And basically they have no idea to understand how much water consumption we have. So they did this great, it was so genius. I still am not over it. They said, how can we get that data from them? And maybe can we nudge them so more people would be willing to do this? So they said, you know what? If you go in and you measure how much water you're using, you figure out if you have a low flush, high flush toilet, you figure out this, not only will we give you a new toilet, we will take your old toilet and replace it. And we're going to replace it by somebody locally, a locally owned company. So the money stays in the community. And then they got what they needed, what exactly Melissa's talking about. They got the data. And what they had to do to get that data was pretty minimal. Like I was the one that went in and checked how much water was in my water tank in my toilet. And while this might seem so kind of silly, I think it just shows how innovative we can be when we look at problems in a different way. And why I highlight Bernalillo County and Albuquerque is we have half of our population is on Medicaid. A lot of us can't, a lot of the houses where I'm talking about, they can't afford new septic tanks. They can't afford to drill bigger wells. And the septic tanks, we have to worry about them leaching into our water. So there's a lot of added benefits here. And I think it's pretty easy. They can say, here's the data and look at all the benefits we have. We actually now know how much water these people are consuming. And maybe we want to get them on city water.
Thank you so much for that example. I'm not sure how they came to that solution, but my best guess was that maybe they had someone in the community suggest something like that. I think in my role, at least, when I'm collaborating with our disability community advisory group, which is members from the disability and access functional needs community that inform our emergency planning process, that's where the best ideas come from. You know, not assuming that you know what the public needs, but really asking the public what they know that they need. Okay, so moving on to, this is our 4th out of 5 questions, and then we'll get to some of the attendee questions. But I believe that this next question also touches on one of the questions that an attendee posted in the Q&A. So this question is asking, which Homeland Security issues are affected by climate change that most would not assume that they were? And I think we'll switch it up and we'll start with Erin.
I was going to talk about heat and violence, but the question about drivers of terrorism got me thinking a little broader about it. We've been sort of tracking the issue within the district. I've been mapping, numbers of dates and numbers of violent crime. It's usually crimes of passion, like domestic violence or maybe gang violence, shootings and things like that, against the temperatures of the days and seeing if there's like a correlation. And I haven't passed it to a real statistician, but my Excel chart says, yes, there is. But an advocate actually made a map of our heat maps of the district that highlight where there's the most exposure to extreme heat from things like higher temperatures, fewer trees that are casting shade, more impervious surface that's absorbing the sunlight. And also it has all these demographic characteristics that make people more sensitive to heat, like age and income and health characteristics. And so they overlay all that in the highest scoring neighborhoods. They then mapped over that where crimes were occurring. And it was like, there was no deviation almost. It was almost like by neighborhood, the most heat exposed and sensitive neighborhoods were also experiencing the most violence. And like I said earlier, we're just at the tip of that hockey stick as the graph is getting higher, and next summer and next summer and next summer are gonna be warmer and warmer. I'm not sure we're fully prepared to, like, the systems in society that lead to violent crime aren't quite being solved yet. So it's gonna become more and more complicated and worse, I think. But this question about terrorism, I think what I haven't thought about is sort of extremism and violence, and whether or not, when it's really hot outside, you might you lose some of the inhibitions that might have prevented you from conducting domestic violence. I don't know if that same thing translates to, a plotted attack or anything, but you might see more impulsive kinds of extremism than we've seen before.
Yeah, I think, again, going back to COVID, we saw a decrease in the number of active shooter incidents, whether, that was because of just people not being out, or it's a bigger story about how emergencies, day-to-day emergencies, can kind of affect the plans of bad actors. Katelin? And yeah.
It's like feverishly writing a comment to that question. And because what Erin is talking about, there is actually a study done in LA talking exactly what he's talking about. It's from 2010 to 2017 that did find a direct correlation between temperature increases and violent crime. So on average, overall crime increases by 2.2% and violent crime by 5.7% on days with a maximum daily temperature above 85 degrees Fahrenheit to days that are below it. So I think you're onto something, Erin. Basically, that's the gist of that. I'll put it in the chat in my answer. But I think what Erin's getting at, and also the person who posted that question, is that when we think of climate change, I think there's this natural tendency to just conjure up images of forest fires, flooding, hurricane, extreme heat events. And for me, I like to think of those as the first order effects of climate change. In other words, the environmental effects. But it's when we start contemplating those second and third order effects of climate change, where we're talking about human displacement, migration, like competition over natural resources, trade, our adversaries taking advantages of the Arctic Circle, for example. Now we start really talking about homeland security issues in a more nuanced way. And these are the things that I don't think we're spending enough time on. I think we are a very reactive society. We are not proactive, as we like to immediately say, oh, there was a hurricane, let's rebuild, we will come back stronger. But we're not asking the bigger question of, well, what happens if the hurricane's bigger next time? What happens if all these people move away and they drive down the cost of housing and now there's no equity and people are trapped in place? We talk about climate migration a lot, but we also aren't thinking about what about the people that can't leave? And these are the most vulnerable populations, the elderly, children, women, people that might be suffering from domestic abuse. They might not have a way out. And then, you know, I think too, one of the things that I really have found interesting and terrifying is just really insurance companies. There is nothing saying an insurance company has to provide homeowners insurance to you. And places throughout the Midwest, like Marshalltown, Iowa, we are seeing a huge increase in homeowners insurance. And if we're talking about resiliency, how can you be resilient if you can't have homeowners insurance? What if your house floods? How do you rebuild? You don't. And now we're putting more burden on the federal government to come in, sweep in, and fix the problem. And frankly, FEMA doesn't have that money or that availability.
Yeah, with that, I think even the individual assistance programs, you know, folks who aren't technology savvy and don't know how to apply for one of those programs, and how do you get the message to the people that, you know, you fail at communicating with on a day-to-day basis, who have their own networks that they go to for information. So great points there, Katelin. Melissa?
Yeah, I think Katelin and Erin really covered a lot of the ground that was in my head. I think climate migration is one of the things that I think a lot about as a homeland security issue. If we have just large numbers of people that are no longer able to live wherever they live, whether that is an island nation or just parts of the world that are just getting too hot for human existence. And therefore we have pressures to absorb a whole lot more people into other countries, and what that does in terms of creating more nativism in those countries and more just political instability. I think the other thing that I think about too is ecosystem collapse. I think we tend to think about the hurricanes, the heat events, but the ocean acidification is one of those topics that I have no solutions for, but definitely keeps me up at night thinking about what happens if we lose all of our coral and we stop being able to sustain the same life in our ocean systems. What does that do to a community that relies on it for fishing? What does it do to just the natural order of all of the animals that depend on those fish to eat, and all of the repercussions that could happen after that? And I think that will have second order effects in the human population as it starts to affect all of our economies.
Thank you for unlocking a new set of fears for me, Melissa, with your answer. But I hear in your answer a lot of the cascading impacts, and I'm not sure who asked the question, but I do see a couple of folks in the chat that maybe work in the intelligence community, and it got me thinking, are climate change conditions or climate conditions, weather conditions, et cetera, being included in intel products? So as you're thinking about domestic terrorist threat, any type of terrorist threat in your product, are you also thinking about the conditions that are happening in that area and how those could influence them? Okay, so then for the last question that we have, at least for the pre-canned questions, I think this is also going to address the first question that was asked in the Q&A. So this question states, what careers exist in the resiliency field? And what are some ways that Homeland Security and emergency management students can pursue them? And I said that this reminded me or related to the first question in the chat, which was asking, what are your thoughts about which non-traditional disciplines and partners we need to integrate into our planning efforts and initiatives surrounding climate change? So actually on the last webinar I conducted, I always ask this question because we do have some students. Those are our main audience at ISU, and we want them to get involved in any way they can. And on the panel that had a lot of folks working in accessibility and inclusion and in emergency management, the answer was kind of, there are only so many jobs that are specifically focused on this within the country. This should really be embedded in every type of job that you can get in emergency management, disaster planning, and beyond. So I'll let our panelists take the job with answering this, but keeping in mind what partners maybe you work with that you would like to see have more education on climate change and resiliency planning. So for this one, I think we'll start with Katelin.
So I wrote out a long list of things that I was thinking of. But now you like threw that wrench in and I'm like, ooh, I like that idea of like, what are the people, who are the people we aren't thinking about? How could they be involved? And I think like first is now is a great time to be in this field. Melissa talked about it 10 years ago, how I feel like how little was going on in this field. I started in this 5 years ago, and it feels like the number of jobs and opportunities just have significantly increased. But with that in mind, I think first is I'm going to talk about how to just expand your resume and experience. I think sometimes we get in echo chambers, we get in silos when it comes to resiliency. We think that it has to look one specific way, right? And I think that's just an inherent thing for Homeland Security professionals. We have our experience, that's what we know, and that's the way we think about it. So I think things like applying for a fellowship, like at the Center for Climate and Security, where I did my fellowship, is one way to kind of broaden your horizons and start thinking about climate change in a new way. When I did the program, I looked at how migration might be weaponized. Climate migration might be weaponized using what was happening at the time in Europe, where migration was being weaponized by Lukashenko. Join an organization like the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. This is a great program that basically they're offering all these different job opportunities, but they're also having a lot of these kind of conversations monthly. And I think these kind of conversations are where it's really important. So you're not just thinking, oh, I have to go work for FEMA. You can, and FEMA is awesome. I'm not knocking FEMA, but maybe there's another untapped area that really needs somebody that's looking at climate resiliency. You already did the plug for CHDS, so I'm not going to plug it again, but you can be like me. This can be a passion project for you. Have your normal day job, but find something where you feel like you can make a difference in your community at a local level or at a different level, or teaching. And that's how I think you can get these really creative ideas of how to enter climate resiliency in new, unique ways that we might not be thinking about.
And I will put a plug here for any of my students in the audience in my resiliency course this semester, that if you would like any of the panelists' contact information, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll share that with you. Melissa?
Yeah, so I've worked on resilience and climate from state government, local government, private sector now, academia, nonprofits. So there are all sorts of people working on resilience everywhere. I like to think of it as an ecosystem, kind of think about what your skills are. For example, I did a short stint with an NGO that did a lot of lobbying. I very quickly learned that while lobbying is incredibly important, I do not enjoy it. It is not the thing that gets me to show up to work every day. And I really, really want those lobbyists to exist, and I want them to be powerful and good at it. It's just not me. So really think about where in the ecosystem you can provide value. I loved the question about what are some of the non-traditional groups that we need to be engaging with. One of those, I think, for example, is artists. If we can have artists help us communicate some of these conversations that we've been having today about understanding risk, what individual actions people can take, how we can start thinking about solutions, that can be a way to amplify some of these messages. I think grade school teachers are also one of the most important groups to have involved because they have young children who are willing and able to absorb some of these messages and then go and tell their parents to do something. And nobody is more convincing than your child telling you to do something. And so we need to start finding ways to have everybody thinking about climate and resilience and what their role is in it, because I truly think everyone has a role.
Great point there with education. I'm not sure. I can't imagine that climate change, quote unquote, is in the school curriculum. Don't quote me on that. I'm not entirely sure. I know that in some of the younger grades, they do teach about natural disasters and other types of hazards, but I'm wondering how much of this is actually on a state's curriculum, and how emergency management agencies can maybe engage with education on that. Erin?
Well, first to talk about that, we actually had some students in DC public schools who advocated to the school board that there be a climate change curriculum, and DCPS, the public school agency, used all of our plans around climate change and extreme heat that were developed both by HSEM, the Homeland Security Emergency Management Office, and my agency, to inform it. They kind of designed it themselves, and they came back to us and said, okay, we looked at your materials. We didn't even know they were doing this. And here's a curriculum we came up with. What do you think? It was great. I was like, someone's actually reading the plans. So they're piloting that right now in middle schools, this past spring and again in the fall. So we'll see how well it's going. But I was going to talk, I know I mentioned earlier the role of sort of the built environment. I came from urban planning and landscape architecture. And when I started grad school in landscape architecture, like 14 years ago, we felt like we were the only people talking about resilience, like that this big climate change thing is happening. It should change how we are designing cities today. And I feel like it is much more common, and there are people actually in a resilience field that didn't exist really back, or we didn't think we'd have a resilience job. But I'm not sure that it has really permeated back out to all these other fields. I have a lot of colleagues who are in urban planning, and urban planning is a really broad field where you might end up drawing pictures of like where the buildings should go. That's more rare. You might just kind of be in sort of a functional role of governance and engaging communities about sort of more mundane issues. But I think that's a huge space where the conversations need to have. It's kind of the day-to-day governance and the sort of smaller, more boring issues, and taking this challenge of looking forward to the future. We know things are changing. We have some projections for what we can expect. How should that inform long-term decisions we're making today? That should be part of like every conversation that anyone who's working in any kind of planning or decision making around community investment and infrastructure and design and all those things. So I would say that if you're studying these things and you don't end up at an actual Homeland Security and or emergency management agency, there is a place for you in the broader scope of governance in urban planning or in public policy for sure. Or go to design school.
I can't tell you how many times I wish I was a graphic designer working in emergency management. But just also wanted to shout out Katelin and give her props for, as I mentioned, this is a passion project for her. This isn't her main role in her job. And she kind of took it upon herself to conduct research and get involved and advocate for resiliency and mitigation against climate change. So for the last question, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to combine two. There's one in the chat, and there was one that was submitted via the registration form. And they both have the same kind of question. The one in the chat is asking about folks that are often criticized by climate change activists, such as people working in industries like agriculture, petroleum, et cetera. How can emergency managers and climate advocacy groups better engage with these communities? So the communities that kind of look at this, as I mentioned before, as a political issue, and how can you get them involved? And then the question from the registration form was asking the same thing, how to remove the politics from issues involving climate change, especially at the local level. And they were mostly asking it in terms of funding. So they lived in an area whose political leaders typically discount the realities of climate change. So almost influencing the population to discount those realities as well. And while it might slowly becoming more real for those in political positions where they live, it still seems only the bare minimum is being discussed. So how can you kind of like persuade the people that are typically discounting these realities, get funding, and get people involved? And we'll start where we started when we first began the webinar with Melissa.
Yeah, I think the very basic answer is that you don't make it about climate. You make it about the real world and life experience that people are experiencing. So if it's a rural community that is struggling with drought, you talk about drought, you talk about how drought might get worse. And then you really connect into the things that the community cares about. Is it public health? Is it economic development? Is it affordable housing? Every community has things that they care about, and we can find the solutions and the way in through those things that they care about. And that takes doing some strategic hanging out in these communities and really getting to know the communities in a deeper way, not just flying into a meeting, having your 15 minutes on the agenda and leaving as soon as your 15 minutes are out. We need to actually understand the feelings that exist in that community and what people are saying outside of the particular realm that you might be working, so you can start making those connections and doing some smart strategizing on how to get a project done. So, you know, if that community really cares about, let's go back to drought and farming and the economy of farming, then you just have solutions that are, how are we going to mitigate the risks of drought so that you can continue to farm? And I think then all of a sudden the doors will just open.
I like the solution focused approach as opposed to the Chicken Little approach, kind of running around saying what bad things are going to happen and trying to scare people into reacting. Katelin?
Melissa, you did a great job again. For me, it's 3 simple words: know your audience, know what they care about, like Melissa so eloquently put. When it comes to dealing like with politicians, or maybe even maybe certain fields that you might assume might not be as open to discussing climate change, I think you really have to look at how it does affect their bottom line. So one of my favorite things that I get to do is emergence program. And I get to talk to law enforcement, FEMA, like I get to talk to emergency managers, firefighters. And when I started doing this presentation, I had a lot of people just kind of being like, really, you're making me sit through a climate change presentation. But as the more I did my research and kind of updated it, the more I realized I was like, I have to make this about the people in the audience's bottom line. So it took me going and seeing who is in my audience, why would they care about this? And that's actually where I stumbled upon that data when it comes to LA. Is I always say to my law enforcement in the room, okay, how many of you anecdotally notice that crime increases when it gets warmer out? And everyone raises their hand. Anecdotally, they know that. And so then I pull up this research, I show them, I have evidence now. And then we talk about, okay, now let's talk about how complicated this is, not because of climate change. That's not what the conversation we're having. We're talking about what it means to be a cop nowadays in a really hot urban heat island. That's their bottom line. And I think sometimes it's not about why climate change is happening. It's about it's happening. We don't really need to talk about why it's happening, but what are we going to do about it? And that's how I think you get buy-in. but you have to know your audience. And so if you're talking to a politician, go see how they vote. See how they vote on certain topics. Figure out how to leverage those things in your favor. Because in the end, you win. You're pushing climate resiliency and it's helping everyone.
Great point. Yeah, sometimes audiences that we wouldn't think of as disenfranchised think of themselves as that. So law enforcement may think that, you know, no one is really paying attention to what they're going through on a daily basis and how their jobs have gotten harder. But especially when we think about populations with disabilities or others with access and functional needs, there might be a distrust in government. So really going in and just in listen only mode and trying to understand what is important to them and then working in solutions to their problems that also have two-way effects. And we'll end with Erin.
Yeah, I mean, plus one to everything that Melissa and Katelin said. I think that we've just encountered this, and we're doing, you know, some community outreach around updating our climate adaptation plan right now. And we've drafted a survey, and we have started to go out to community events and like block parties to start talking to people. And after the first couple events, we were like, oh, these survey questions don't work for some people because they talk about climate change. And some of the people we're talking to's first reaction is to think that climate change, maybe they don't not believe in it or think it's political, but it's just something that happens in Indonesia related to islands or polar bears or something. So we're just starting to talk instead about heat and flooding. And we're not saying climate change. We're just talking about the impacts. And we are mentioning that they're getting worse, just like Katelin was saying. And it's given us opening with that and talking about people's homes and experience of flooding and fear of heat is a much easier entree than saying, what do you think about climate change?
Yeah, good point. And I think there's certain disasters that typically communities weren't seeing that now they are. So I know that, you know, DC experienced a tornado a number of years ago. That's not as fresh in folks' minds, but as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, those extreme rainfall events, those are getting more and more frequent. So kind of bringing up the events that folks haven't seen in the past that are really scary and have really big impacts and are kind of the unthinkable that are happening in the here and now. Well, I have just gained so much knowledge from this panel. I wanted to thank you all. I have a lot to think about to work into my own role, and I hope all of the practitioners and students and researchers that attended this webinar will walk away with the same. So Melissa, Katelin, Erin, thank you so much for taking out your time to be with us today and engaging in this discussion. On behalf of Idaho State University and the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Program, we want to say thank you to our audience for also taking your time to participate in the conversation today. And for anyone who wants more information on Idaho State University's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Program, you can visit our website at www.isu.edu/ESD. So with that, thank you very much. We will use this recording for these courses from generations to come. But if anyone would like any of the contact information to have a more in-depth discussion with the panelists about either future careers in resiliency or mitigation or emergency management in general, or myself, just feel free to reach out. My email address is on the screen right now, or you can reach out to Lori Holian, who you received the invite from. With that, have a great night, stay cool, and have a good rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.